more or less complete. Thank you very much for, again, your presence for already the second webinar on CCCEV. So as you know, we had a very good first discussion on March 30th, so about a month ago, in which you gave us lots of valuable feedback on, I would say, the revised version. So the team worked hard over the last few weeks towards this second webinar, which is, I would say, the formal presentation of the different, or I would say a formal presentation of how we tackled the comments and the different questions received. So again, this will be quite an intense session as there is quite a lot of content, but there should be sufficient room and time for discussion. I don't know who's managing the slides. If we can just jump to the agenda. So the agenda is pretty straightforward. So in a moment, I'll give the floor to Pavina, my colleague, who will provide a little bit more context of the work that was done since we met last time. And then the team or the tech team will go through all of the points in a detailed way, and there will be, again, space and time to listen to your views on how we tackled your comments. And for each comment, or for each, I would say, question, we also propose a solution. So without any further ado, Pavina, happy to give the floor to you to provide some context.
Thank you, Seth. First of all, I would like to welcome you all and to thank you for attending this second webinar on CCCEV. Next slide, please. It is the objective of this the current webinar is to present the changes related to the previous discussion and to discuss and agree on the proposed change in order to proceed to an official release. Next slide, please. As already said and mentioned, recently we started an effort to revise SEMIC solutions. We last week we had a very interesting webinar on the revision of core vocabularies, which will continue in the months to come. Here we are going to discuss to try to come to reach the point of a final an official version on a core Criterion. And last year in December we released GeoDecat AP. Next slide, please. So as we said earlier, previous webinar, which was a very interesting one, took place the 3rd of March. So we hope that during May, mid-May or end May, we'll be able to provide to release officially the current version of CCCEV, the second one. Next slide. So during our previous webinar, there was a discussion and some proposal about how to discussion on how to pronounce CCCEV. The official pronunciation is CCCEV. However, different alternatives were presented, such as C3EV or C cube EV. Since we are thinking that it is not so appropriate to change a vocabulary's name, so that because continuity and the coherence may be lost. So we would like to kindly ask you if you see a significant need apart from the pronunciation, which is a bit weird. Yes, we know, but if you think that is critical to change the vocabulary's name, we will be happy to see your comments in the chat on this. We believe that if there is no significant reason, it will be wise not to change the vocabulary's name, even though it doesn't sound so nice. Please, next slide, please. In order for those that didn't have the opportunity to attend the previous meeting, we said that there was a need to go from version 1 and create an updated version 2. I will briefly, in the next slide, please, to tackle to present the differences between the two versions in terms of classes. Overall, the rationale behind changing CCCEV to version 1 to version 2 is on putting emphasis on the part that has to do with the requirements to be elaborated in more details compared to CCCEV version 1, because since 2015 that the previous version 1 was released, and the use of CCCEV in information systems, there was the need was expressed to better tackle those the requirement part. So as you can see in the current slides as well as the following ones, we have a comparative list of classes between version 1 and version 2. So in terms of the formal framework, we renamed it as a reference framework, all depicting legislation, but in class 2 it is had a very broader sense. In version 1, we only have two classes: the criterion requirement, which was defined as an atomic requirement, and the criterion, which was defined as the rule of principle used to judge, evaluate, and assess something. However, in version 2, this term criteria requirement was further elaborated and split into different classes, having a central one, which is the requirement, which is defined as a condition or prerequisite that someone requests and someone has else has to meet. The criterion, which is a condition for evaluation of assessment. The information requirement, which is a request for data that is proof of evidence or that leads to the source of such a proof. And since there was a need to constrain, to impose to several constraints into the requirements as such, we introduced the class of constraint was introduced in order to apply to requirements and the concepts that the requirement is about. Next slide, please. Next slide. Moreover, we introduce somehow a bit more intermediate class, which is the information concepts and refers to an entity or a class or a property which is used to describe information in the evidence to be provided for the requirement, somewhere in between. And in order, since in practical systems, in real-time system, we need to provide to support the specific values that for that an evidence should meet. We also introduced the supported value class. As you can see on the left side, those notions of evidences and the requirements were depicted, were modeled in version 1 through a limited number of classes through the requirement group, and as well as we had also the requirement response in the previous version, which was the assertion that the response criterion requirement, which was removed from the current version, because practically it was depicted through, it was covered by the other classes. The class evidence remained in both versions. However, the definition was slightly changed. Next slide, please. And we elaborated more the evidence type list and the evidence types, since this need was expressed by systems such as Icertis, where different types of evidence are and as well as a different type list may be required in order to fulfill a specific criterion, as well as combinations of them in different use cases. We also removed the documents reference that was referred to the previous version, referring to specific document attestation or data. However, we kept the agent class, but in version 2, it is defined in a more abstract way in order to be able to capture a broader list of things. We also introduced the dataset class in order to be a collection, to depict, to cover a collection of any type of data. So those are the on gros the differences between the classes, but those can be better elaborated and be understood through an example. So I pass the floor to the team to present you an example.
Thank you, Pavlina. Perhaps first allow me also to introduce Max Dekkers, who will be moderating this session. Max, would you like to say a few words first before we deep dive into the content?
Yeah, so hello, Max Dekkers here, member of the team at PwC for the editors of the vocabulary. And what we've done is we're going to give you a couple of examples. Basically, some of them are a little bit on the basis of the examples that we had in the first webinar, but with some changes that were discussed in the meeting last time. And then after that, we're going to discuss a number of issues that were brought up, where we have in part proposals for resolution of those issues. There are some of them that we have already discussed last meeting, and for those we're going to sort of present the agreement that we had last time. And also we have a couple of issues that are currently out of scope for the vocabulary, but certainly will be handled later. So I would give the floor to Dimitri for presenting the example. Dimitri?
Yep, thank you, Max. So we worked out a new example. As you might remember, for the people who were there last time, we had an example within the context of getting married, what you have to then supply as evidence. This time we worked one out using a criminal, the basic idea often here within procurement that you don't have to, you cannot have participated in a criminal organization in order to, for example, be a part of the tendering process. Just a very quick recap, as we did last time. You might remember the previous version of CCCEV, which looked like this. As also Pavlina already stated in her introduction, there were a number of changes needed, a number of improvements, such as creating more semantically enriched requirements, enforcing the machine readability capability of the model, supporting multiple request-response patterns. You can see, for example, that you can either verify a claim, you can prove a condition, or you can simply provide data. The three different options. To shift the description of the different possible ways to fulfill a requirement from the requirement side, as you saw in the slides that Pavlina presented, we had requirement group and criterion requirements, which is now more shifted towards the evidence side with evidence type lists and evidence types. And on the other side, we also align with DCAT dataset to take over the metadata from DCAT within our model. So a number of reasons that led to the development of this new version. that's presented here, already incorporating the changes that were discussed last time. So you might already notice an added relationship, for example, here, to specify the agent that is providing the evidence and also the validity period of the evidence. But we'll come to that in a minute more in detail when we dive through the issues. This is so mainly the basic model, and I would now like to present an example using this model, so being version 2 of the model. So this is an overview to give you a bit of idea how the example is structured, but I'll now go zoom a bit into the different sections of the example in more detail. I'm afraid this will be a bit too small for you to see. So we start from a criterion that you have to not participate in a criminal organization. I think you will probably recognize this criterion as it is an often used example. And in this fictive example, there are two ways that you can, or two types of evidences that you can provide in order to satisfy this criterion. For example, the first one is the absence of a criminal record of evidence. So an abstract that you have indeed no criminal record known to the federal government, for example. And other countries, I know, for example, in Belgium, they also have a different kind of certificate called the Certificate of Good Conduct, which is more or less the same thing, but just a little bit of different semantics. It's basically saying indeed the same thing, that you don't have any criminal records. Just the context is a bit different of this evidence type. So two evidence types that can both be used, that can both be provided by certain agents to satisfy this criterion. As we said, one of the main improvements of this version is that we have machine readability. So we can express certain expressions that are requested from the evidence provider. In this case, we are requesting the information concept of non-participation in criminal organization. For brevity and for simplicity, it's indeed the same naming as a criterion. In reality, I think it will be a bit more elaborated exactly what is the information concept to make it a bit more concise example. It's just the same description here, but in reality, it will be a bit more specified and really clearly written out what is meant with this information concept. You can, of course, give it an identifier. And this is a new thing from last webinar. You know, if I added an attribute called expression of expected value, within which you can, for example, say we expect within the context of this criterion to have an answer that equals to true. Don't mind the expression language yet that's written here. It's a fictive language. We have an issue coming up for that to discuss this more in detail. So this can be used to have a machine readable concept. It can then automatically be processed if the evidence provider answers with machine readable evidence. There's also a constraint on this criterion, being that this evidence cannot be issued longer than 3 months ago, especially in this context. Let's say you have an evidence of good conduct issued 3-4 years ago. Of course, it can no longer be relevant, as you might have committed a crime in the meanwhile. So this is the reason why we have specified a constraint, for example, saying that the evidence should be issued no longer than 3 months ago. Also written in effective expression language, just as in the previous information concept. So this is the top part of the example. This is basically these are the classes or the objects that the evidence requester is specifying. So this is the evidence requester side that is being modeled out. On the other side, we have, of course, the evidence provider. And then we have certain links coming from the evidence that we'll show in a minute to this top side of the model. So we have the evidence, which has a number of properties. As you know, it is a subclass of DCAT dataset, so it inherits quite a lot of properties. For example, being the identifier, date on which it was issued. Specific properties to CCCEV are the is about relationship. We can say the evidence is about a certain person. It's mapped on the core person class. And a validity period. This is new from last version. So we've added the validity period of an evidence, which can have a start time and an end time. Again, for brevity, this is a date currently, but date time is supported, as you might see in the general model. So in this case, we have an evidence that is conforming to some sort of evidence type. In this case, the certificate of good conduct. So you have a link to the specific evidence type according to which this evidence is structured. And now we have the supported value. So when we have the value of true that is being supported by this evidence. So in this case, indeed, the person has a certificate of good conduct, so he has not participated in a criminal organization. Therefore, this value is providing a value for this information concept. And by consequence, this evidence is also supporting this information concept. The same for the other information concept. So we have the information concept of the constraint on the date that the evidence should have been issued the longest. And the same way, you have a supported value, in this case, the date on which the evidence was issued, that is providing a value again for this information concept. But you can see this everything can be machine readably executed. This then gives us the entire overview of the example. I noticed I forgot to mention one additional relationship that was added, being the provided by evidence. It was also mentioned last webinar that it would be useful to also have this relationship included within the model. So we can also specify the agent, in this case, for example, the Federal Public Service of Justice, being an organization that has provided the evidence, which can, of course, be, most probably will be someone else than who is the subject of the evidence. I think we went through the example, but I saw some questions coming in. If there are other things unclear about the example, please let us know in the chat or raise your hand. And we'll give you
saw one message in the chat from Enric asking about the namespace of the information concept. Is it something that you can
yes.
clarify, Enric?
In fact, this was a requirement requested by TOP, because in their architecture they have a repository of ontologies that they use precisely to define the concepts that, for example, a base registry can be asked for. So that was considered important, because then you can scope very well the semantics and the data type even of what is being requested and expected. We even had some examples in XML. I think in XML we call that a qualified namespace or something like that. So my question is whether this idea of being able to specify the concept namespace still exists or have.
Bert, is that something you can?
Well, actually, there is the identifier for the information concept. And so if we have semantically identified the concept, so then you essentially know in which context and what the semantics of that is. So it's the connection is through this semantics. Now, of course, if you want to start reasoning on a collection of information concepts belonging of originating from a particular ontology, etc., that is outside the model here. So if there's editorial support, if you think of a system that should create requirements and connect this with information concepts, then you probably need additional information around those in order to facilitate the creation of criterions and relating them with information concepts. And that is something I think well is a design and has a lot of effort on the implementation side, rather than on the let's say the critical key information around whether or not this information concept, what it is the meaning about, because you can handle this through the identifier.
Does that answer your question, Enric?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. I also saw Max, you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, I see one from Georgia who says that she hasn't understood correctly the evidence and evidence type. Maybe you can, Dimi, you can spend 2 words on that.
Yeah, indeed, what Henrik is saying in the chat is indeed correct. So an evidence is really like belonging to one person. It's really an instantiation. So for example, me and my ID card, that's my evidence. Well, evidence type is more indeed a template. So for example, some can be a data model, can even just be a PDF format, so to say, according to which an evidence can be structured. So it's really more like about really the general abstract idea of the evidence. Well, the evidence itself is really like the instantiation.
Does that answer your question, Georgia?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. I see question from Kostas Simatos. Does the information concept serve to provide instructions on how to evaluate the criterion? Or is it meant to be something more specific, like the expression presented here? It's something that we cannot currently respond to. I think the idea of the information concept is quite broad. The addition that we did in the last version was this expression that you can put in to actually tell the other side what you're expecting. But there are, and this example here only lists those attributes of the information concept that are useful for this example, but there is more in the information concept. So maybe we can have a look at that and what you can see if that is what you need for that. Okay, and then the question how CCEV relates to W3C verifiable credentials. We come back to that later.
Yeah. Okay.
So continue.
Yeah. So no further questions. I propose that we dive into the open issue points and all the discussion points that we have. So I'll briefly first introduce each issue and then, of course, let us know your comments in the chat.
Yes. I'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah, thanks. So expressing expected values, that's really what we just tackled a bit with the example. There was a comment from last webinar that besides the description that was in the information concept, or within the criterion, sorry, there was no possibility to express an information concept of a requirement, being that criterion or constraint, as a value, which made it a bit more tricky to, possibly impossible to the machine automatically compare the supported value that is provided by the evidence and then the expression of the expected value related to the machine processable requirement. So that's actually what we added, as we just showed in the example. So we have added the attribute expression of expected value within the information concept class. So you have something you can evaluate against when you provide the evidence. So this is added as a literal in the information concept class. And for now, we have made no specific constraint on the expression language that is to be used for this information concept, for this attribute. As you see, we have also used a fictional expression language to not give any recommendations on this. But there are a few, of course. You probably know XPath, JavaScript, OCL constraints, RAF. So there are a number. Our proposition is to leave this open to the implementation or to a specific application profile, which expression language is to be used, but to leave it open within the core vocabulary to what specific language is to be used.
One question from Peter Kremen. How we would do testing of validity and usability of the models. Bert, want to say something about that?
If this is means on evaluating this. Okay. If this is with regard to evaluating the expression language, then this is a part of the application profile or implementation model to establish how that will be done. So in an exchange, when receiving this value that is supporting this information concept, then this expression will be evaluated using the appropriate or agreed language in the context of this application profile. That is the idea. So the how it will be done, that is then explicitly up to the application or the setting, the usage context setting in there. What you might note is that this language that we didn't made a collection of kind of sub-elements like minimum value and minimum expected value and maximum expected value, and on other ways to express expectations. So we concatenated this all into one attribute, one concept. So it's so it can be, it has to give means and words in terms of an application.
A question from Cecile asking how to annotate which language you're using. How to annotate?
Yes,
so we have a language, and the language is open. You can actually choose the language that you want in a particular application. The question is, do you identify which language it is?
Well, I would, but this is a question on how, if we want to continue on this, how to annotate and to make this visible, saying, for instance, an application profile will support 3 different expression languages. I would not advocate for that typically, because it makes your life a lot more complicated. And then you have to find a way to find the annotation.
So it's up to the application profile.
But can I ask a question? Because it can be that these rules or these expressions that are in a very varied, depending on the system. So you are considering merging several business registers with several implementations. So I think that the information about the expression should belong to the expression, how it is expressed. It's what I was meaning. Because if you put it in an application profile, you assume that it's the same for all.
Mm-hmm. But this is on the expectation side. So of course, if you're just only sharing expectations and you don't, if you're sharing CCCEV expressions, and this is the purpose of your system, then it can be any language, of course. And if you don't do anything with it. But if you start interpreting the value, then you have to know, of course, what language it is. And then it comes to how to annotate this. And do we want to annotate this? Yes or no? This is, we could add this. No?
Sorry, I copied in the chat. This is Enrique speaking. I copied in the chat a link to one ontology that is being developed in Belgium, I think, in the University of Ghent, where they do precisely something that is abstract enough so you can connect the representation of a function with one or more particular implementations of that function. So maybe you should look into that and see whether that could be a good recommendation or not for the application profile. That's just a suggestion, of course.
Okay, we'll take that
this
suggestion.
Is similar probably as Riff does. Riff has as well these profiles.
Okay, so we'll take that point up. Any more comments? I don't see any more comments, so can we move to the next one?
Yep. Okay. Regarding temporal information, this was also already quite discussed at length during the previous webinar. There was a general agreement at that time to include temporal information within CCCEV and also on 2 different parts of the model. On the one hand, we should have a requirement being able to ask some validity period on the evidence. As we gave in the example, a certificate of good conduct cannot be issued more than 3 months ago. And on the other side, also on the evidence. And you could specify this evidence is will expire at this date or is valid in this period. Regarding the second bullet point, I'll show you how we address this in the coming slides. Regarding the first bullet point, the The difficult part there is that this is rather, this can become quite complex. It will probably never be that you specify within your, for example, let's say in the domain of procurement. Okay, sorry, there might be some absolute dates feasible. For example, you have to answer before the end of the month, then you have an absolute date, but most often this will be quite a more relative date. As for example, expressed here, you cannot have a certificate issued more than 3 months ago. So then you don't really have an absolute date for the requirement. That's why we propose to tackle this temporal information regarding a requirement via the constraint class, as we shown in the example. So you can express it using your expression language and also machine readably execute it. And for the evidence, you can more easily link to a period of time class, as was already existing in the previous version of CCCEV, which we have now related to the evidence with a validity period relationship.
Okay. I see no questions, no comments here. Anybody has a comment, a question for the approaches in those two areas, temporal information for requirements and temporal information for evidences? If not, then we'll move to the next one. Oh, there's a question from Kostas. Would you use the constraint to also enumerate expected or possible values for a criterion evaluation? So if there is more than one expected value.
I think, sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, I think in principle that there are modeling opportunities here that we have. Depending on the case, you might end up in a case that you have to be, let's say, you have to be adult or supervised person, something like that. These kind of things, then in principle, an expression language with an OR and with a union can handle this. So there's a bit of the connection with this expression language again. On the other hand, you could start expressing the ORs in terms of the additional requirements and enumerating this in this way, if this is relevant. So it is a bit of the depending on the best fit for purpose case.
Okay. Question from Enrik. To have a criterion evaluation and or an information concept evaluation?
I think this is a comment that is
yeah, it's in response to contribute to Costa's understanding, because and it's in the definition, by the way, of constraint. It applies to the whole criterion or to one or more concepts, information concepts inside the criterion. This is very important, in fact, in my opinion. So it is interesting that the definition of the constraint encompasses both, because that is what is actually needed in many scenarios.
Another question from Peter Kremen, whether we consider linking to the OWL time ontology. We have actually considered that.
No, we have not considered. I think here we have mostly considered the fact that we can express a moment in time that corresponds to the validity period, because that, and then continues to Tamas. This is a core vocabulary. So the end and the start time are properties that you can use to express your validity period, but you're not obliged to do that.
And a point from Tamas, whether it's required to use both the start and the end time, and that I think is a question of your application profile. The core vocabulary state you can provide those. How you exactly provide them is up to your application. And the other question is, how can you convey the requirement evidence should be valid for a duration? That's basically saying what the end time is for your evidence.
Sorry, but end time, it's not, I'm talking of the template. So in the template, you don't have the time. You have just, you know, this is send time. You will know at the moment that it is really sent. So this is the problem I see.
Okay, I don't.
You mean on the expectation side? Eh? You mean on the expectation side? Huh? Cecile?
Yes, I mean, when you set out the requirements, you know that there is an evidence type that is needed, and this evidence should be not older than blah blah. And this not older than blah blah, you don't have the time, you have a duration.
Yeah, and that's the example that we tried to address it through the information concepts.
The previous slide.
To the previous slide. Maybe Dimi, you can go back to the
That one.
That one. So the idea was that this to consider this as a constraint that you would express through an information concept, and that we therefore do not need an additional property expected validity period. That was the idea, that we could cover it in this way in a more generic fashion. That we try to reuse what was there, well, extend it with this expression and have this in this way capturing. And that's the reason why this supported value appears in the response side. Okay, even if the validity period is expressed as a metadata in this approach, you have to explicitly say in the response, I support this information concept for the validity according to the information I have received in my metadata with this value.
It lacks a bit of business approach, but and I see that you have some things in the chat.
So there is another thing.
Can I ask a question here? So what you are saying here is, with this expected, how do you call it, expressed
expression of expected value.
Expected value in the information concept, you are modeling like 3 months, like 3 days, like 5 years, or something like that, correct?
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes. Okay.
So you are not definitely modeling a duration, okay? Because it's a string, so it's not really
it's modeling an expression, and to be evaluated.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So the question from Alexandros, whether an expired evidence will include a renewal process, and I think that we can say that's outside of the scope of the vocabulary. The vocabulary says just that you're providing evidence that has a certain validity. If the validity has expired, then actually your criterion, your requirement fails, and then you might need to do it again to provide new evidence. And the core vocabulary doesn't actually include the processing of renewal of evidence. I think that's the short answer. Costas asked whether those expressions are for humans to read. No, they're actually intended to be expressions that are machine processable. That's the idea.
Can I just react on this? I think it's easier if I just voice my thought about this. I'm just wondering how this would actually work to have these expressions be actually parsed and executed by a scripting engine. It would be interesting to see a real example instead of the fictional, let's say, expression examples that you have here, to see how this could potentially work. Because I have my doubts that you could actually just take completely out of context expressions and pass them into a scripting engine, which needs some very strict constraints on what it's actually executing, and have this actually evaluate to something.
So I think that's work for the future. When the vocabulary is being implemented, we can see whether we can come up with some actual real world examples.
May I comment and to add onto this? It is right, Kostas, that it is not a free lunch in the sense that you have to make agreements in the implementation on how you identify the information concepts, how you identify the supported values that you receive that's connected to it, and how you integrate that in this expression language. So in order to have this executable, really executable, that are the elements that you have to do, kind of variable bindings, agreements, or naming conventions in order to point to these things. And that is the challenge.
Just to add a point here, which I think also Cecile is also agreeing on, that if you want expressions that are really going to be correctly processed by scripting engines, we're talking about something that's going to be very specific and technical, but then this removes their understandability for humans, unless they're developers and experts, let's say. So I'm just wondering about this as a kind of a mechanism to convey both, also to give expressiveness for people to understand what this is about, but also provide the means to automatically evaluate the criteria.
Okay, I think this is a fair point in the sense that the more we are going towards executability of this expression, let's say the human readability will disappear. It will be much more bound to the execution system in which it sits and it features, and therefore let's say the human out of kind of reading will be harder to do. So that is
it's a balance.
That's a balance on how to see. So we try to merge the things into one, but maybe this is kind of an impossible dream, and to have the two need additional properties to express
the human readable one and a machine readable one, for example. Okay. So let's move on to the next one. Agent roles.
Indeed. So during the previous webinar, a suggestion was made to include another role within the model, being the evidence is provided by an agent relationship. It can be different, for example, from the agent the evidence is about. I think the example came from Mark Christopher, who said this was also something very relevant in the procurement domain, where this can differ greatly. Is it okay for everyone to include this new relationship? You're on mute, Max.
You have the definition of that.
Yes. Sorry.
Isn't this covered by DCAT? If an evidence is a DCAT data set, then maybe DCAT already provides a solution for this?
Not necessarily. I think we wanted to have that in the vocabulary rather than as something that could happen in a data set. I think that was the.
But then is this a sub-property of something in DCAT?
Yeah,
that's a good question. The only one which is kind of close enough to be there is the publisher. So that would be the most natural one, and I'm not always sure if this is people would interpret this as the publisher. That's just my personal feeling.
So it would not, at least not be a sub-property of something in DCAT. It might be a sub-property of something in Dublin Core, for example.
Yes, it might be there, but well, in DCAT, most of the properties are reused of Dublin Core, the roles public. So there will be the ones same. So I'm open up to the community in sense of is DCT publisher a good mapping here for this one?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I am if I am the person of that evidence, probably I'm the creator. No, really, neither. I mean, the creator is probably the issuing authority that creates the ID card that then distributes to the citizens, okay? But the publisher, I mean, in which way we publish here evidences? I mean,
So you
publish is something that I put on the web, for example, for everybody to be used or reused in the case of the data set. But here I don't see really the point to have a publisher. I mean, if I look in the previous slide of the roles, you know, probably I see somehow the creator that can be the issued by part, probably, and the rights holder that is something that is not in DCAT, but it can be like, well, not really. I mean, there are different semantics here from my point of view.
But be aware also, Georgia, that what you think of as a publisher is one thing. I just note that the definition of DC terms publisher is an entity responsible for making the resource available. So that has sort of a wider connotation than the publication of a document on the web. So that's something that we also need to look at, whether that definition is useful for this case, yes or no, or that we want to have a more specific definition. But I think is something we're probably not going to decide here and now. I think the proposal last time was to make the link between the evidence and the organization that that makes it available, let's say, and that is what we now have as in the model. And how we express that, I think, is maybe something that we need to spend a little time thinking about. Is that correct, Bert?
Yes, but I think it would be good. I just will issue in the chat a poll if people feel that this could be the same or not. We have an expression of it. I can feel that the word publisher might not be the wording that people are using in this context. But I really can understand.
Good. Let's just put that on the list for further work, and then we'll move to the next one.
Yep. This was also a comment regarding the evidence type. It was saying that it doesn't have an identifier attribute on it, which might be useful in some cases. So we have just simply added it with a data type of literal to be also quite general. And you'll see we have also added it on a few other places. I'm not sure if it already was an evidence type list, but I think we've also added it, and also on reference framework. We'll talk about in a minute. So basically on the key concepts within the model, we have everywhere added the identifier property.
Okay, any comments there on the evidence type ID? I think it was something that was discussed last time, and we have the description of GitHub.
But what is the proposal? To remove it, is it?
No, to add it.
To add it.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, isn't it enough of having a URL or a URI for the evidence type?
Yes, but it was requested to put that there, and we have it in various places also. So in my mind, I always think having identifier is always a good idea when you can use them. For example, it's the same, for example, in DCAT. Dataset has an identifier also for that reason, and we thought this is sort of a cheap option to add it there if people need that.
Because you need then the scheme ID and all these attributes at that point, is it? In the case of, as Jerry is saying, in the case of Isertis or whoever. if I understand it well. Okay.
No, here it would be just the identifier, really just the identifier of the instance that you're sharing. That's the idea to have it. And if you use this as an RDF structure, of course, then we have the challenge that the node is the identifier itself, and that we find this kind of a duplication or repetition to add saying my URI is the identifier of myself. So it is a bit as well to facilitate other formalization, serializations to make this as well explicit.
And an answer to Peter Brun Andersen's comment that it needs to be optional. In the core vocabulary, everything's optional. You can use whatever you want, but in an application profile, you would say which ones you use and which ones you don't. So we're not saying anything about things that are mandatory or recommended or optional at this stage in the core vocabulary. Okay. So move on to the next one.
Yep. Also regarding the evidence type, there was a comment made, I think it was from Jerry, if I'm not mistaken, that it would also be good to have a pointer from the evidence type to the location where this kind of evidence type is being issued. For example, you can have a Belgian ID card evidence type that is then being used in Belgium. So I think, please, Jerry, if I'm misinterpreting, please feel free to.
Yes, the issue here is to provide a kind of a coverage area and a jurisdiction area of the evidence. So where this evidence comes from, it's not where you can use it, because if we do this on the SDG grounds, you need to know where to get this from, or where is the jurisdiction of this evidence. But this could be used throughout Europe through the SDG. But we need to be aware, for example, I am a citizen in Athens of a specific municipality, and for proving a specific requirement, I need this evidence type, and this evidence type is issued on a specific location.
Okay.
So we need to be aware of this location. Yes.
So we added that one. Is there a... No, the question from Rita is why not an issuer which then has a location? The functional requirement that was provided to us is you need to know in which region, in which location it's being provided, and not by whom, because that is something
I can also add that to that, if I may. So regarding this, the issuer, for example, you might have an evidence which is the birth certificate, and in Germany you have one evidence, which is the birth certificate for the whole of Germany. So this issuing place will be Germany. However, the issuer are more than 10,000 in Germany. So you cannot go with the issuer here. The issuer can be multiple, while the jurisdiction can be a single one.
Okay, I think Rita said okay. Then let's then, if there are no more comments here. What is the location is virtual? I don't think this is the functional requirement here is a virtual location. I think the location, what Jerry just said, it's either Germany or Flanders or something like that. So is that correct, Jerry?
Yes. What Henrik means with virtual? I don't know what virtual is.
What is a virtual location?
Well, the virtual resource that provides you with the evidence type. I mean, if you, and especially in these days that you cannot move physically around, so this should be somehow connected to where to get this evidence type.
Yeah, but that's, I think, also in Jerry's example, that's in the application. It uses that information to find out exactly where to get it from. It's not the core vocabulary doesn't actually do that for you currently. Jerry, is that can you?
Yeah, it is okay. I was thinking more about a documentation issue, saying, okay, the source of the evidence type can be a physical or virtual. If it is physical, then you use co-location. If it is virtual, this is solved in which way? Yeah. So the vocabulary provides resources for that. But I was just thinking, how do you explain that? Yeah.
Can I add one thing here? I mean,
Yes.
the evidence type, the issuing place is where that evidence has been issued.
No.
So it's a physical. No.
No, the is here is where the evidence type is being provided. Not it's so it's not where it is issued. It's the place where you can actually get it. The geographic region, as Jerry said, either in Germany or in Flanders, that's where this evidence type is available.
Okay, so I
You
would
can-
just
You have to think
to
of the
change
evidence
the name.
type always as a kind of template, not
Yeah, I mean,
the actual
okay.
instance. Okay.
Yeah,
And
but
that could be
what
also
I'm
the case.
saying, if I can conclude, is the spatial coverage that has been mentioned before, from my point of view, is different because that has been available in that place, okay, in that country, but it probably valid in terms of geographical stuff in all of Europe.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Can be this a case?
Yeah, that's of course.
So it's probably we need something more.
No, why would we need something more? That doesn't say anything about where it's valid. It just says if you need this evidence type, this is the place where you can get it. This is the jurisdiction. I think that was the question that we had earlier.
Yes.
It needs to be the jurisdiction where this evidence type is available.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if the jurisdiction is only Belgium, okay,
Yes.
okay, is limited to Belgium, but in some other cases, some other evidence type, the jurisdiction is more than one country. How we express that?
No. I think you're reading this wrong. You're thinking that this is the validity of it, the jurisdiction
Exactly. What
that
I'm
this
saying,
evidence type is valid, but it's not that. It's not
okay,
that in which it's valid. It's the place where these evidence types are available.
I understand. But what
Yeah.
I'm asking to the domain expert is that we need also validity, spatial coverage, something like that. And if we need, with the current model, can we address this functional requirement?
So if you want to say, as receiver, I accept because of inter-member states agreements and global European legislation, these evidences from that member states. For instance, is that the case that you want to express?
But one good example could be the ESPD. The ESPD, what they have in the regulation, well, in the directive, is that an evidence type that is issued by Belgium must be recognized as valid by the rest of the member state. So maybe this is out of the scope of the vocabulary, and it's something that belongs to
the legal context in which it's working.
That's what, so you can express this in several ways. Anyhow, the requirement sites can capture that in a detailed fashion. That's an ability that you can have over there. But interpreting that legislation, that validity expression is not in a shorthand available in this model.
I have a question that's linked to this about another kind of evidence, because here we're talking a lot about things like identity cards, birth certificates, and stuff like that. But imagine you have evidence such as, let's say, a certification. Imagine a Microsoft certificate or a Prince2 certificate or something like that. Yeah. Here, there is an issuing organization behind this, but the actual geographical location where you actually go and get this is meaningless in itself, because you just need to access basically an accredited certification center. But you do need to express the requirement that this is issued by such an accredited certification center, but there are thousands worldwide, you know? So it's not one location, but it's kind of a type of location. Is this something that we could express using these concepts, in your opinion? And I think this is quite a common evidence type that is requested. Huh?
Yeah, I don't think we have heard that requirement up till now, so we don't have it in the model. Is there something, Bert, that we need to think about, or is there something that we can have an immediate answer to?
I mean, I could also imagine with the examples that we've been discussing that you don't, for example, have to go to the commune office in Belgium, for example, to get a birth certificate. You could get this from a consulate in another country, for example. So the actual location that you get these things from, the physical location, maybe that's kind of, in certain cases, secondary. You just need to know, to have the assurance that this place, or there is one such place that is capable of providing this.
Mm-hmm. Which is what I think the location class provides you with. You can do that on any level of detail, granularity, but I don't think it covers the case that you just came up with, that there is a sort of a certification authority that is responsible for these evidence types, and I don't think we have that in the model.
We don't have, let's say, well, it could be implicit in the sense of if you organize a collection of evidence types and you list all organizations with their evidence types available, then it could handle it. But it's probably not the most, let's say, concise and way to do and to express that. So that aspect is not there. There might be an implicit approach, and that can be handled, is that you have an evidence type certificate, and that in the requirement side, you ask support for the credential authority, because probably that's the case that you anyhow want to check and have this as information, and this must be provided. And this must be part of a list that is acknowledged. So in that sense, a lot of the these constraints are as well capturing by the requirement side.
Yeah.
So
okay, so that for the time being, we're not making the changes, but I think we keep that certainly on the list of things to consider and to maybe have examples of. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
We move to the next one.
Yeah. As I already briefly introduced moments ago, also the reference framework class has no properties. So we also added the identifier property on there. So you have at least some reference to an external identifier system.
Well, this is because back in the time when we defined this reference framework generic concept, we said that this also is a data set or somehow is connected to TCAT to describe where to get the specification from. So maybe this is the thing that is missing here. You have a reference framework. Okay, imagine this is an ISO or a specification or a legal framework. So you need a URI to get the specification.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. The subclassing from TCAT dataset is no longer in there, as you might know, because you wouldn't want to make that restriction that it has to be a TCAT dataset. That's indeed why we have to add the identifier property. And also an open question if there are other properties that make sense to add as well. But it can be a URI.
Yes. URI is a valid value for literal.
Yeah, but so then let's put any URI literal data type then, if we want to express that, because if we have, so the reference framework is already a resource, okay? Yes. So an object that is typically identifying with its URI. Yes. So if you want to simply say that the requirement is derived from a reference framework, you can just put the URI of anything there, at least, but we need to say that the reference framework is everything, okay, or a data set or whatever you want. Because if you put then the identifier in the class as a literal, it seems like a string.
Yes, it is, but that's if we look at, for example, DC terms identifier, that's a literal.
Exactly.
That's a string of characters.
Yeah. That's my point. So, I mean, if it is just because you want to specify a URI, you don't need to specify an additional property for the reference framework, let me say.
Yeah, that's true, but we also said that there are cases where you actually are not in RDF, and there it would be useful to have the identifier there as
okay,
a.
So that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, but so I would suggest in the description to be quite clear here, with some examples.
Yeah. Okay. And the question was, are there any other properties that people would think are necessary here?
Well, I recommend you to visit the ESPD project, because there they had plenty of them. Like, for example, when this reference framework is a legal framework, then they had the need of specifying not only the URLX URI, but also the directive or the type of legal framework, whether it was a directive or a regulation or an implementing act, etc. The article, the very specific part inside the article, but this should be generalized. I mean, you cannot stick to legal frameworks uniquely, because it can be anything. It could be, for example, the European interpretability framework, which has been used.
The idea is that you now have a reference in the identifier, a reference to the reference framework, so you can actually look it up. Do we need to have those attributes here in the core vocabulary, or would we agree that it is something that the description of the reference framework, the external description of reference framework, provides you with?
The second thing, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Cecile said validity consideration of reference framework. What do you mean, Cecile?
That the reference framework might be become obsolete, but it's not that something I would say yes, you need to add it, but I'm just to think about this, that if you have a requirement that is on a reference framework that has become obsolete, then maybe the requirement will become obsolete. So the reference framework guides the requirement management, but it's a bit too early maybe it will be for later discussions.
Yeah, I think maybe also it's an application problem to say which rules you have for those things. And the question from Kostas is this class associated with a formal framework of CPSV? And yes, there is a relationship between them, but that's something that we come back later in the presentations for some issues that we know need to be covered. And this is one of them in terms of the alignment between core vocabularies. Okay, so we take the next one.
Yes, this was also already briefly, it was already discussed at length in the previous webinar. Just to quickly check it off again, whether we all still agree with it. So in the example presented in the previous webinar, we had a flow of requirements. So you have a criterion saying the applicant is an adult, an information requirement saying we need to know the age of the applicant, and then a constraint saying the applicant must be at least 8 years of age. So you see really like a flow going from the criterion to the information requirement to the constraint. An example presented today, the criterion was there and also the constraint, for example, not the information requirement. Because that was also what we agreed during the last webinar, that there is no particular restriction on the use of these three subclasses from requirements. This is basically up to the application implementation to see how do they work together. Do you have to provide all three of them? Can you also simply use one of those? That was basically agreed during the previous webinar. We just wanted to check it again off, whether you all still agree.
Okay. Don't see any comments on this one, so it's just verifying that what we decided last time is still what people agree with. And then we'll move to the next one.
Yeah. Also the same here. We also agreed last time that the bidirectional relationships that were in there are the ones for which a preferred direction is not really clear. So for example, you can start from evidence type lists and then drill down, or you can work the other way around. You can go from evidence types and work your way up to evidence type lists. There are also other bidirectional relationships. I think, for example, on the requirement class, that you start again from the top level requirement and drill down, or you start from the bottom and drill up. When there is no purely preferred direction, we have added both relationships, so in both ways. Is it still okay that we keep them in as bidirectional relationships where there is no preferred direction?
Okay, so again, that was something that was agreed last time. So we just wanted to make sure that people can see that agreement again.
Yeah.
Any comments? I see there's a bit of discussion about reference frameworks and legal frameworks. And as I said, we're going to come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Next one.
Yeah. Yeah, that was also already asked by Peter, I think. I'll give Bert the honors to present this.
Yeah, so this is if we look to alternative approaches that exists, there's one that is typically mentioned, that's verified credentials W3C. If you look into that one, then you will see that there is terminology used that is very close or very related to the one in CCCEV, but there are as well differences. So if you look to claim credentials and so on, then comes close to what in CCCEV is mentioned with evidence and supported value. As well, but this is different. So there's some, they are not exactly the same. Sometimes the claim is a supported value, sometimes it's the evidence, sometimes it's the combination of both. And there are still some differences. We have noted them down in the short analysis. So one of the example things that you have to know is that W3C verified credentials is looking towards the evidence providing in a trusted distributed context to enable this trust. And so the goal is there to build up the trust. And it's not on the side of the requirement description. So in CCCEV, a lot of the model is about the requirement description. This is not present in verifiable credentials. So it's only the evidence provision, and then mostly focused on securing that the trust of this evidence that has been delivered is correct and good. So that makes that things are still somehow connected, but still different. And as mentioned earlier on by Seth, is this connection between how to build up trust and to share trusted data is something that is questioning on the side of the data models and the data standards that the core vocabularies that we're describing. Do we have to incorporate information about that? Can we facilitate that? But as well, in the other way around, if we look to the emerging technologies like solid or blockchain, etc., and in this one like verifiable credentials, how they can use the core vocabularies in a natural fashion, and that the both communities actually reinforce each other. But that is of course for the future, and to work this in a more extensive way.
Okay.
So this is much more for the future work.
And the question from Peter, is it possible to include and reuse VC and CCV? And I think that's exactly what Bert said. We're going to investigate that.
Yeah, just in short, you probably are capable to create a VC approach connected with CCCEV. But that means that you have to combine together into one application profile setting. And you have to make decisions that the VC approach and the CCC approach are nicely connected.
Yeah, indeed, Bert. So, Peter, I'm sure that in the light of the, so once that we wrapped up the work on the CoreVox, we'll tackle, of course, the an application profile for the SDG based on CCCEV, and I'm sure that in the light of that, we'll be able to make progress here on the verifiable credentials. We completely underline the importance of embedding this. So it's just not something that we can immediately tackle here in the current revision of CCCEV, but it's we're putting it very high on our agenda.
Okay. So with that,
yeah. So just to add, there's another connected issue that has to do with seals and digital signatures that will be taken in the same approach.
Okay.
To complement on this, since both issues are related to trust and they need to be closely studied, we think that since the proposed version 2 has a lot of new concepts, we need also the focus is on these new concepts and at a later moment to tackle the verified credentials as well as issues such as digital signatures and seals, which are very complicated topics.
Okay, with that, shall we move to the next one?
Okay, this is another element of future work or related work that goes into an application profile. Often we receive, if you can imagine a situation that you receive data in a particular format with a particular supported value. And then the question is, can I interpret it? Can I work on it? Can I evaluate it? And sometimes there's kind of need or usability for doing transformations on the received values before actually be able to validate that. And this is in the light that the discussion that we had in the beginning on these expressions that is connected with that. But if you really want to include kind of transformations of the whole structured information that is being received, then we have to investigate this much more in depth.
And our proposal is to work with the people on of the single digital gateway to see how it can be supported. Okay.
Just add a thought on this. Sorry for jumping in, because I made the comment previously in the expressions. I mean, my advice here would be to really pilot this before putting something down in the core vocabulary, because I remain quite dubious about the fact of trying to express high-level concepts, requirements, criteria, and so forth that are supposed to be understandable from a semantic perspective, and at the same time try to favor automation, machine-to-machine processing and stuff like that as part of the same definition. We'll have to see how this plays out by piloting of some sort.
And that's what we're suggesting to do, to work with the people who have that requirement and see how it can be done. And then if we can generalize it later, then it might come into a further version of CCCEV. But you're right, we shouldn't put very complicated things in there that then in the end don't work. So we should take it from a practical side. I agree with you. Okay.
Okay, just a comment from the SDG side. We just
Yes.
want the core vocabulary to be able to support this so that we can create an application profile. That's our concern here.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. I think
Next.
yeah, I've come to the last issue. It was already indeed discussed at length in the chat. So within the second version of CCCEV, we use reference framework instead of formal framework to make it a bit more broad. So also informal frameworks can be reused. And also, as you might see, legal and non-legal specifications are just included within reference frameworks. Thinking about procedures, tendering legislation, and so on. Which is also why we have opted to differentiate from legal resource as used within CCCEV. First of all, do you agree with this decision? And also, do you feel the need that we should make it more explicit what are the relationships between legal resource, reference framework, and formal framework?
Okay. And I think what we need to also say is that there is various issues that we've seen with alignment across the four core vocabularies and the application profiles that we have. And there is certainly a task for us also to look at the further alignment.
If I may,
the same things.
I think, if I may, Max, sorry for interrupting you. I think that there is also an effort on behalf of the CPS VAP to align to the CCEV, because they are using entities and relationships from 1.0 version, and things have changed dramatically for them since then. So this is a message I was trying to pass them, but they were waiting for us to finish and get a stable model, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but that's part of the fuller alignment. There might be other relationships between the core vocabularies that we need to look at, and we're certainly going to do that. Okay. Next slide.
I think we're through with the issues.
Okay. Any other comments? You know, we still have our GitHub, of course, for further discussion. Are there any points that people want to bring up here and now?
Hi, it's Natalie. I would like to make a comment. It's not really, it's more technical than anything else. If I look at your models, it seems to me that you're using Enterprise Architect, yes or no?
Yeah, correct. Indeed.
So I just wanted to point out a problem that we found when we were doing the procurement ontology, and I don't know if you're aware of it. When you export to XMI so other people can read your file, Enterprise Architect, if you have not given a cardinality, gives it a cardinality, it gives every attribute a cardinality of 1-to-1. You have to define them yourselves. Otherwise, if they're reused anywhere else and exported, all the cardinalities are 1.
Okay. No, that's helpful. Thanks for the comment. We'll take note of that. But I think as the core vocabulary puts no restrictions, it's actually 0 to infinite.
Well, that was exactly my point, you see. If you export it, everything will be 1 rather than 0 to many. If it's 0 to many, you have to actually put 0 to many. So perhaps you need to export to XMI, change the cardinalities and re-import. I don't know.
Okay, thanks for letting us know. We'll,
okay, any other?
Yeah, if there are no further comments, I would say this is perfect timing. It's 12:30. So I think the whole team explains in detail the I would say the open standing issues we still had, and I'm glad that we don't have any, I would say, stumbling blocks at this stage. And so based on the discussion of today, we'll work then on, I would say, the final version, which will then be published, I would say, anywhere towards the second half of May or the beginning of June. So thank you all very much for your input and work on helping us to make the best out of this revision. And so once that we wrap up this work, we'll be able then to, I would say, make progress on the much needed application profile also for the SDG. So we continue to, or we hope to continue also to rely on your feedback for that process and action once we get there. Pavlina, any extra words from your side?
No, first of all, I would like to thank the team as well as all the people that attended this webinar. It is very important for us to have your feedback, and I would like to encourage you to put your concerns or issues that you have into GitHub so that we can always have your site there, your needs expressed into GitHub so that we can always proceed also to the next to the official release. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.